Chairman McCaskill, Ranking Member Heller, and members of the committee. Thank you for asking me here today to testify about the cobalt ignition issues. In March of this year, General Motors Board asked me to determine why it took so long to recall the cobalt and other vehicles that contained the faulty ignition switch. My explicit mandate from the board was to provide an unvarnished report as to how and why this occurred, pursue the facts wherever they took us, and to put those facts into a report. That's the report which we submitted to the board. General Motors Board also directed me to make recommendations drawn from the facts to help ensure that this did not occur again. Jenner & Block, my law firm, was given unfettered access to General Motors witnesses and to their documents. We interviewed more than 230 witnesses. We, in fact, conducted over 350 total interviews. Some of those interviews lasted over 2 days. We collected more than 41 million documents, all in an effort to find out why the cobalt recall was delayed for so many years. In that research, in terms of the investigation, we looked at every CEO. We looked at all of the engineers. We used search terms, the sorts which would produce documents of any kind which might relate to this issue. So no one was exempt from that review. I will not summarize the report. You have it. I will, however, note that among the issues we specifically examined are the issues that are the topic of this hearing: accountability and corporate culture. We asked questions of dozens of witnesses, from top executives to line engineers, about these topics. We examined the decision-making processes that related to the ignition switch issues and whether there were broad cultural issues which may have contributed to the delayed recall. The story of the cobalt is one of a series of individual and organizational failures that led to devastating consequences. Throughout the decade it took General Motors to recall the cobalt, there was a lack of accountability, a lack of urgency, and a failure of a company personnel charged with ensuring the safety of the company's vehicles to understand how General Motors vehicles were manufactured. In our report, we reviewed these failures, including cultural issues, and that may have contributed to this problem. At General Motors Board's request, we provided recommendations to help ensure that this problem would never occur again. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Valukas, I understand there was a sharing agreement with Delphi that wasn't as forthcoming as you would have liked it to have been. Do you think the limited information that you received from Delphi and their employees prevented you from providing a complete report?
No. I believe at this point, having had the chance to, with the extra 6 weeks or month that's involved here, and looking at what we have in the way of materials so far, I think our report is complete. I'm comfortable that this aspect, the Delphi aspect of it, that we have that information.
Is there anything that we don't know that's relevant?
No. I promised and committed to an earlier committee that if we found something different, I've told the board of directors, and they directed me, that if there was anything factually that we learned that would in any way alter the report or add to it in a significant way, that we would supplement the report. And I would make that commitment to this committee. But right now, I believe that everything that we could know about this issue, we put forth in that report or in a supplemental letter.
All right. Mr. Valukas, I understand there was a sharing agreement with Delphi that wasn't as forthcoming as you would have liked it to have been. Do you think the limited information that you received from Delphi and their employees prevented you from providing a complete report?
No. I believe at this point, having had the chance to, with the extra 6 weeks or month that's involved here, and looking at what we have in the way of materials so far, I think our report is complete. I'm comfortable that this aspect, the Delphi aspect of it, that we have that information.
Is there anything that we don't know that's relevant?
No. I promised and committed to an earlier committee that if we found something different, I've told the board of directors, and they directed me, that if there was anything factually that we learned that would in any way alter the report or add to it in a significant way, that we would supplement the report. And I would make that commitment to this committee. But right now, I believe that everything that we could know about this issue, we put forth in that report or in a supplemental letter.
Do you feel that Delphi shoulders any responsibility?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you feel that Delphi shoulders any responsibility? of the 13 deaths?
That's a legal. I can tell you this. I can tell you that we, General Motors, approved the switch knowing that it was below torque values, and that was an approval that Mr. DeGiorgio gave to Delphi, and Delphi manufactured a switch in accordance with that approval.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, all of you. I spoke earlier about Natasha Weigel, grew up in Elberly, Minnesota. Car goes barreling. The car she's a passenger in, 70 miles per hour in Wisconsin, into a grove of trees. And this story isn't just tragic because Senator Baldwin and I have constituents and because the facts are tragic. It also turns out to be an important part of Mr. Valukas' report in terms of what happened here. In this case, a Wisconsin state trooper named Keith Young conducted an investigation himself after the crash and clearly made the link between the defective ignition switch and the failure of the airbag to deploy. Trooper Young's report cracked the code that seemed to have evaded GM's engineers and lawyers for years. He wrote in this report, and this report was in GM's legal department files as of February 2007, he wrote, quote, "The two front seat airbags did not deploy. It appears the ignition switch had somehow been turned from the run position to accessory prior to the collision with the trees." This just, Mr. Valukas, I think, did you interview people about this report, and did you figure out why no engineers had read it in GM?
What happened with this report was that the report, and I believe correctly analyzed the situation back as far as 2007, was collected by GM as part of EIS, which is their claims administrator, put into what is called a rumor file, and then at some point it was accessed by a paralegal. The paralegal then sent it to NHTSA as part of the TRED responses. At no point, and we had this forensically reviewed by outside experts, at no point was that report accessed between then and March or so of 2014 when this investigation was undertaken. So during that period of time, it was in those files, that rumor file, and no one at GM looked at it other than back in 2007 when they sent it.
So this is like an official state trooper report. I know it's in a rumor file, but it seems to me it's somewhat official. And then I think there's also an Indiana University study. They were commissioned by NHTSA to look at this crash as well. And was that also in the rumor file?
No, that was actually they actually did not even have that. They didn't, even though that was publicly available, GM did not gather that public information. That wasn't something they had until 2012 when an outside expert for a plaintiff's lawyer made it available as part of their report.
Mr. Valukas, in your report, when did the legal team know about this problem?
When did they first learn of the fact that they had airbag deployment issues?
Yes.
I think you could go back, if you go back to their investigators, that would have been probably in the range of 2007 that it was called to their attention in a NHTSA meeting, one of the individuals involved there, and there became an inquiry about that by the investigator who was assigned to the GM legal team.
And when did they know about the ignition switch problem?
Well, the ignition switch problem developed over a period of time, and I would say that the first time that I can recall that this matter was being called to their attention in some way, which is not to say that it related the two, may have been as early as 2009, 2010.
Mr. Valukas, is it your view that the changes that have been made would prevent what happened from ever happening again?
I believe, based on what I know is taking place, and with regard to the answer is yes. I think that one of the things that's happened here is with the flow of information, what you are able to identify, which they didn't in this instance, were the trends quickly enough so that the engineering department, to the extent the engineering department wasn't acting on it, and going back to a comment that had been made earlier, the legal department would be in a position to push that and force that to take place.
Documents show GM kept silent on fatal crashes. I think this is extremely disturbing because, as Senator Ayotte pointed out, these inquiries were called death inquiries, And what you're saying, Mr. Milken, even the one that was issued under your watch, you never saw it. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
You never saw the death inquiry from NHTSA, who regulates the auto industry and safety. You never saw it.
That is correct.
So who was the top person who saw that?
Pardon me?
Who was the top person in your department who saw that inquiry?
I do not know who the top person was who saw that, Senator.
Mr. Valukas, did you ask about this issue in your report?
No, I did not ask about that. We did not ask about that issue.
Thank you. You should have.
May I correct something I said before? I don't want to leave something missing.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. I was asked whether or not we had looked at those death reports. We did look at those death reports, as Senator Boxer had asked. We reviewed those, but we reviewed those for purposes of seeing whether there was information in there which would reflect on why and how this took so long. We did not review them for some other purpose.
My question to you today, have you accepted the Valukas report as factual?
Yes.
Is there anything in it that you think is erroneous or misstates the facts in any way?
I think overall the Valukas report characterizes and captures what happened. And that's what we've dealt with, and that's why we're going to implement all of the recommendations that were made.
So my question to you, Mr. Milliken, if the CEO has just said on the record that this report is factual, why has General Motors refused to stipulate to the Valukas report as factual in bankruptcy court?
Senator Boxer, or excuse me, Senator McCaskill, I'm not aware of our position on that in bankruptcy court, but I can tell you that that issue is associated probably with the attorney-client privilege issues that are present in that proceeding. And on that basis, they're probably taking that position. But I'm not familiar with the position that you're talking about in bankruptcy court on that issue.
Mr. Valukas, one of the things that was interesting to me is the DeGiorgio situation where he's, you know, this is how old I am. When I tried to explain to my staff that Mr. DeGiorgio reminded me of the character in Hogan's Heroes, I know nothing, nobody on my staff even got it, because none of them had ever heard of Hogan's Heroes.
I get it.
I'm hopefully that you've heard of Hogan's Heroes. It is astounding to me that Mr. DeGiorgio has refused to acknowledge all of the involvement he had in changing the switch. But it was interesting to me, you said there was no evidence that Mr. DeGiorgio ever told anyone else about switching out the part and not changing the number. But then you went on to say there were emails, that were copied to other engineers.
Correct.
But your report didn't go any further about the other engineers that were copied. Could you briefly, because I'm over my time, my colleagues are here now, could you briefly explain, if you can remember, and if not, I would like to get it for the record, who the engineers that were copied on emails that showed that this part had been changed?
Yes, let me give it to you briefly, and then I'll give you much more detail since there is a time issue here, and I'm happy to submit that. On the report, page 102, there's a footnote 417, which focuses on this issue. And very briefly, what took place was there's an email of June 2nd, 2006, which comes from Delphi. There are 30 people on that email. 6 of them were associated with General Motors. The email related to changes that were taking place. Most of the changes they were talking about were in the circuit board.
Right.
And we sought out the individuals who were on there. They were, at best we can tell, we don't know that all of them were. We think they were all on the ion side. None of them had any knowledge. Strike that. The individual we talked to said this meant nothing to him about the change in the D10 switch. He was focused on the issue of the electrical issues that were involved here. Best we can tell, none of these, and from our information, we were not able to reach all the other 4 that are long retired, and we couldn't find them. But they were not at all involved in the process of stalls, non-airbag deployment, or stalls in particular, that issue at all.
So this was just an issue that the people that were copied had no understanding of the significance of that information in the email.
That's short and sweet. That's what we understand to be the case. But I'll get you the detail.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you, everyone. Mr. Valukas, your report demonstrated very clearly that the ignition switch issue was viewed internally at GM as a customer convenience issue, and as a result, it just didn't have that kind of urgency to fix it. From your report, this is a quote, "Not one of the committees considering a fix for the switch, which were filled with engineers and business people whose job was to understand how GM's cars were built and how different systems of the cars interact, ever reclassified the problem from one of customer convenience to one of safety or demonstrated any sense of urgency in their efforts to fix the switch. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, what took place back then, we're talking 2004, 5, 6 period of time where they knew, in fact, that there was the knee-off and that the switches weren't, that the cars were, in fact, stalling. In fact, they knew at the time of one of the press events that was taking place, and they had the New York Times articles and other articles which were calling that to their attention. But what happened in connection with this, a single engineer or an engineer looked at this and said the stall doesn't constitute a safety issue. Having made that decision, that's where they went in connection with that. But we went back and asked the individuals in that committee, those committees, did you know that the airbag wouldn't deploy if it went into the accessory? And the answer was no, we didn't know that. And the question then became, well, had you known this, would you have responded differently? And the answer was yes. So what we found was the people who were in this silo looking at the switch were not covering the issue of the deployment, which was in another silo, if you will. So those who were making the decision did not focus on that issue and claim not to know about that issue.
And somehow that state trooper saw the issues together. I just found that interesting.
Mr. Valukas, you made a couple of conclusions, one in the House hearing and one in your report, that I thought, I'm very familiar with your report. I felt like I was back in school, studying, cross-referencing, going to the acronym table. I did think it was thorough. I did think it was complete. But a couple of conclusions are interesting to me. One is that you said that you kind of went out of your way to conclude that GM did not put cost over safety as it related to this defect. And I think the facts in your report are inconclusive in that regard. And, you know, all you had to go on to say that is what the people that you interviewed told you. And these were the same people that you have called out for indifference, incompetence, lack of urgency. Is there something I'm missing here that you base that conclusion on?
Yes. And if I could be helpful
Sure.
in this regard. My experience as a former prosecutor, as an individual who's a litigator, is that people's recollections are what people's recollections are, and sometimes they change over time and considering where they are in a given point. So I focused, and we focused initially and throughout, on that 41 million documents that we were reviewing and that we were pulling out, and looked at that for purposes of saying, okay, don't tell me what you're telling me now. I'd like to know what you were thinking and doing then. And as we reviewed those documents very carefully on this issue. Do we have evidence on these issues where someone is sending an email or writing a memo or doing an analysis which says, well, I'd like to deal with this problem, but it costs too much, and so I'm not going to deal with this problem. So where you would have cost over safety. And we looked at that issue in a number of different ways. So the witnesses testified to what the witnesses testified to or told us, and you have that in the report. But the documents do not reflect a cost over safety matter. That being said,
that makes sense.
we also call out the fact that there was enormous cost-cutting taking place at GM during that period of time. Engineers were being doubled up with additional information. People who were assigned to safety things were taking on 2 and 3 assignments where there had been 1 before. And we could not say with certainty that wouldn't have had some impact.
So macro cost-cutting could have been part of the influence, but you found no smoking gun in evidentiary documents that would indicate this was actually being discussed.
Yes, and in no testimony. And in fact, in the testimony, people absolutely disclaimed that. They said that was not the way they were doing business.
Okay. The other thing that jumped out in the report that I found astounding was the recall on power steering. In 2010, you recalled the General Motors did a recall on power steering defect. And what was interesting about that is that, of course, you did not consider a recall for the stalling problems with the faulty ignition. And according to the report, GM did not consider the loss of power steering a safety problem. You internally noted that power steering was normally a customer satisfaction issue. Cobalt was handled in a different manner based on GM's desire to obtain a quick resolution and closure of the government investigation. So all NHTSA had to do was write a letter saying they were going to look into the power steering defect, and you guys were called. You did the recall on the power steering defect. Alan Adler, GM's manager for safety communications, remembered that GM had initially been planning to characterize electric power steering as a customer satisfaction issue, but as a result of the congressional scrutiny of Toyota and the unintended acceleration issues, it was agreed that GM should issue the recall before the hearing so, quote, we would not get mentioned and dragged into the Senate. That's concerning to me, Ms. Barr, because it looks like there was a quick reaction when NHTSA threatened, combined with congressional action against another manufacturer that got the result that was so desperately needed on this ignition switch. And one of the, of course, tragic ironies is one of the young women that was seriously injured in one of these accidents, her car had been taken in for the power steering recall, and it was fixed for the power steering. But of course, there was no recall for the ignition switch. So had the same urgency been around the stalling and the engines turning off and the ignition switch issue, have you figured out why structurally there was such a quick response on something that you typically wouldn't have quickly responded to? And do you really feel you've gotten a handle on changing that in the culture?
Yeah, I think the Valukas report captures, and you've stated, you know, largely the reasons, and also if you look then at the data around the power steering, it clearly led to support that. I would say I do feel that we've gotten that around that very much so, and I think I have data to support that with the recalls that we've done. Because when you look at the fact that in some cases of the 29 million vehicles that we've recalled this year with 58 recalls, in some cases we recalled vehicles that have no field incidents. Because when we went back and looked from a systems engineering perspective, did it meet what it needed to meet? If it didn't, even if there was no field data, we've made the recall.
It would appear to be in GM's interest to make public some of those documents and testimony that underlie your report. Is that correct? You just made reference in your response to Senator McCaskill, and I thought, here's an example of transparency actually working in GM's interest.
Senator, I can't respond to that question. My responsibility was the board asked me to write this report to gather up the facts. I believe we did what we were asked to do. The issue of how it will be disclosed or what should be disclosed resides with the client. I don't have that authority.